Good morning and welcome to the 7th meeting of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee in 2025. Before we begin, can I please ask everyone to ensure that their electronic devices are switched to silent. Our first item on the agenda is consideration of whether to take item 3 and 4 in private. Are we all agreed? Thank you. And our second item of business today is an evidence session with the Scottish Human Rights Commission and on its report on economic, social and cultural rights in the Highlands and Islands. And I welcome this morning to the meeting from the Commission we have Professor Angela O'Hagan, who is the Chair, and Dr Louis Yanis, the Highlands and Islands Project Leader. So thank you both for joining us this morning. Just to remind you, you don't need to operate your own mics. We've got someone that will do that for you. We've got until approximately 10:30 for questions this morning. So I'm going to kick off. So the Commission has been seeking the incorporation of ESC rights for quite some time, and we know that the Human Rights Bill is now delayed. So can you tell us how such a bill would affect the ability to meet human rights obligations in the Highlands and Islands?
Good morning, Convener. Thank you very much for the invitation to come and discuss with the committee this morning, and we're very much looking forward to a rich discussion on this report, which is, I'll let Louis speak to the technical detail of your question, but what our report does is demonstrate the significant gaps in people's everyday lives in relation to their economic, social and cultural rights, and the extent to which duty bearers or public services, those with an obligation to ensure the rights of all are met effectively across the domains of education, health, access to food, housing, clothing even, are not being met across the Highlands and Islands. And so without incorporation, we are left with a significant accountability gap in terms of holding those duty bearers to account. We're also left with a significant gap in relation to our powers of investigation and inquiry, which is why it's so important that the Commission has done what we are doing with our spotlight reports, which is to take the international human rights standards, as we have done in this report, present them in a framework that allows us to demonstrate our findings and the evidence, and for duty bearers to then to look at the gaps in their provision and understand from there where they need to go. But I'll let Louis pick up on the substantive point in your question.
I think one of the important things to say is, as of now, good human rights delivery based on the framework, as you see, really depends on leadership of different either local authorities, NHS boards or the Scottish Government itself. So if you have very good leadership in one institution, you might see the delivery of services on a people-centred approach. If that leadership changes, or if the view of a different authority might differ from that, you don't have the same type of results. So if you were to look at the obligations that are attached to these rights that we've highlighted in page 18, for example, in the general findings, these are minimum core obligations, progressive realisation, non-retrogression and adequacy. None of these obligations are embedded into Scots law. So there are aspects in which, just to give an example, a local authority or the Scottish Government itself can cut the budget or eliminate a service without the necessary consultation or the mitigation measures, and none of that is prohibited in law. You're not required to deliver a service, such as health service, that meets the criteria of accessibility or availability or acceptability or high level of quality in the way that human rights demands. What we have in our system is a mismatch between what we are expected as a nation under international law to deliver and what we've committed as the UK to deliver internationally for the people of Scotland, and what we actually demand from duty bearers, so from the government, from local authorities and other domestically. And so the reality is, without the underpinning legal duties, you can have a lot of strategies such as the one that currently the government is consulting, such as mainstreaming, but without the actual legal underpinning and the requirement to do so, you will not necessarily see the change that is needed, particularly for the Highlands and Islands. So taking a human rights-based approach, looking at the issues holistically, for example, progressive realisation, so demanding to actually have concrete targeted steps of improvement, doing correct human rights budgeting to allocate the money where the demands and the needs are, ensuring that things are not cut or deteriorated, ensuring that services are delivered adequately. These are all things that are essential to be embedded in that legislation that we currently don't have.
Thank you. If I remember, when we looked at children's rights not that long ago, there was always an argument that incorporation wasn't absolutely necessary, and if people wanted to do the right thing, they could do it without having the legal pressure to do that. So, is it possible to improve access to justice for communities in the Highlands and Islands without that incorporation? And if so, how do you suggest it might be done?
I think our report, well, I don't think I know, our report sets out a number of recommendations. And these recommendations are around the realisation of specific rights and the specific obligations on public bodies as duty bearers, and on processes and ways of working. Now, Louis mentioned mainstreaming. In our report, we produce, on the basis of our findings, we have 8 key recommendations which are about ways of working and ways of engaging for public authorities within their own remit, whether it's an individual local authority or an individual health board, but also, and I think this is really crucial in the context of Scotland, where we have multiple delivery partners and delivery agencies, that they work together. But our first recommendation is to strengthen the law, to strengthen human rights law, because without that, and as Louise has said, we don't have, and as I mentioned in my opening remarks, there is an accountability gap. Of course, public authorities can and should be fulfilling their international human rights obligations currently without domestic law to enforce it. They should be doing it anyway, but it lacks that enforcement and accountability. So our first recommendation is about strengthening human rights law and improving access to justice, because without the legal underpinning, individuals have no recourse. And that's what we mean by that horrible word, justiciability, bringing it into domestic legislation so that these rights, as well as being an entitlement in people's everyday lives, are accessible through the legal process. And that also requires a level of funding and support through legal aid, which is something that's very high on the Commission's list of areas of concern. Louise has also talked about meeting minimum core obligations, and that's our second recommendation, is that there is no reason not to meet those minimum core obligations. Minimum core obligations are a floor. They're not a ceiling, they're a floor below which people's everyday experiences should not fall. And this is what this report shows really clearly, that those everyday experiences are not meeting minimum standards of access to food, access to clothing, access to housing and healthcare. The adequacy of service is another recommendation. Are people's needs being met in the context of where they live and what their needs are? And that requires effective intersectional analysis across people's different experiences and different sets of needs. Duty bearers can also meet their obligations by listening and acting on what local people have to say. And this is one of the main strengths of this report and of our approach, is that it has amplified the voices of local communities, including local councillors and other elected officials who say they've been raising these issues for some time. But what local communities have been saying to Luis and his team and across the Commission is that they've felt heard and felt that their voices have been amplified in a way that they haven't been until now, because people are not routinely engaged in making decisions that affect their everyday lives. And flexibility and localised policies, again, that's about ways of working, which don't necessarily require legislative underpinning and are also supposedly behind the intention of all sorts of activities and directions of policy making around community empowerment, community wealth building, community planning. We hear this word community in a lot of what has come through policy making in Scotland over the last decades, but what we're seeing is communities are not engaged in local policy making. And effective impact assessment is something that I have spoken about to many committees in this Parliament over many years, and making impact assessment effective from a human rights perspective, but also ensuring that remote and islands impact assessments are carried out in conjunction with local communities. And then, as we set out in the framework, that there should be specific human rights targets. How, in developing services and securing the adequate delivery of those services, what targets can be in place to help duty bearers move on and secure the right outcomes. And one of the ways that helps deliver those correct outcomes for people is taking a human rights perspective to how resources are allocated, spent and evaluated to secure the progressive realisation of rights and to ensure that rights are respected, protected and fulfilled. So there are ways of working that would make a difference, but the legal underpinning still means that people are without that access to justice and accountability for duty bearers.
So it's almost, you know, the incorporation of these human rights, it's almost a backstop, but it's required to ensure that other policies that might be trying to deliver some of these human rights actually have teeth, if you like.
Yes, I mean, it's the ultimate sanction in a sense, but it also is the state party obligation for the UK government to incorporate the treaty and indeed the Scottish government. And at last week's, 2 weeks ago, the Committee on the International Covenant for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the committee members were at great pains to highlight the need for the UK government and within that the Scottish government to incorporate in full the covenant.
I would say, to add to that, which I think is important, is one of the things we find really important. It's not about ensuring that we have excessive judicial accountability, so excessive cases in the court, but it's a lot about prevention and it's a lot about addressing structural problems. So what we found a lot was very effective casework, for example. So MSPs get contacted by their constituents, these issues are raised, and often solved at that level. What happens is the structural problem, the structural barrier isn't addressed. It's what Professor Katie Boyle in her work, which we've worked closely with her, called the feedback loop, which is really important. So an issue individually is solved, the structural problem, the barrier, that the cause of that problem is never solved. And so repeatedly we see one person having the same issue over and over and over. Without the legal underpinnings to stop that and the legal accountability or the mechanisms to ensure that these systemic barriers are removed and what we call guarantees of non-repetition, so ensuring that it doesn't repeat to anyone ever again, without that accountability, we will find ourselves in this continuous failings that we see often, and many of you will directly see them in your casework as well.
Okay, thanks. I've got two supplementary questions, but one it was on a response that was given just now. Emma.
It's so lovely to have you both here. I just wanted to pick up there, Angela. In response to the convener, you had mentioned the need for a legal framework for enforcement sanctions and empowering people and giving them that recourse to justice. Is it also important in terms of offering legitimacy and making it easier for those who do have every intention of upholding people's human rights, you know, giving them more respect in the rest of their organisation or more authority?
Thank you very much, Ms Roddy. I think that is a really helpful way to frame legislative underpinning as an enabling platform to do the right thing. And I think it takes a refreshing and really positive approach to a human rights framework and the range of tools of impact assessments and so on that are often perceived, I think, as an additional burden rather than as a way of being able to do the right thing, to make policies in a different way and in a way that more effectively discharges the responsibilities of public authorities and makes more effective use of public resource.
And Burgess.
Before I ask my main question, I just wanted to pick up on something that Louise, you were talking about there around the individual problems solved, but the systemic piece is not solved. And that's actually come through on work I've been doing in another committee around the Scottish Public Service Ombudsman and the issues there. And one of the things that come up through that work is looking at trauma and what happens to people and how they go into a very kind of head-based system, but actually what's going on is quite a lot of emotional challenges, and there's no space for that. Would this, if we move into a more human rights-based approach, I know I'm hearing you saying that it's trying to address the system, but is there a space for addressing that emotional, traumatic space that people often get hooked by something and can't get free from?
Yeah, absolutely. The emotional barriers to accessing justice is something really important. And again, I'll refer to our work and the work of Professor Katie Boyle in actually looking at one of the barriers of accessing justice is the emotional or traumatic experience that might mean. Now, from an international perspective, and we said this very clearly in our work in relation to a human rights bill, is that remedies, so the routes to remedy that have to be available for Scotland, need to be accessible, need to be affordable, need to be timely, need to be effective. And within the element of both accessibility and effectiveness, actually ensuring that an individual or a victim in this case is properly supported, is provided with the necessary means. Do they know what their rights are? Do they know how to proceed? Are they well supported? Do they feel they are respected? Dignity is, of course, essential to the human rights framework. So is someone feeling that they can go through that process? Now, what we currently have, if you see in our recommendations in Access to Justice, we highlighted the amount of cases in the last 2 years that reached the Scottish Public Service Ombudsman, so the SPSO, and the amount of, based on our questions to yourselves, to the Highlands and Islands MSPs, how many instances on a weekly, monthly and yearly basis are MSPs receiving complaints or issues related to their fundamental ESC rights. And we see that mismatch significant. We see on issues around health where 82% of MSPs that reply to our questionnaire said that on a weekly basis they receive complaints or issues about health, whereas we have a significant a limited number, and I'll actually look the specific number, whereas there would be only 60 complaints related to health in the last 2 years by the SPSO. So not only is the experience can be traumatic for some, it's also that people do not go to the SPSO, and so there's a challenge there. Why are people not actually accessing the formal systems that we've put in place?
My main question I wanted to ask is coming back on the convener was talking about the Human Rights Bill initially, and I wondered if, okay, we don't have the Human Rights Bill in this session now, and your recommendation is for it to come forward in the next session, but I wonder if you're aware of any other bills that are coming forward in the pipeline, like the Housing Bill, where we could look at bringing in rights in that way. So Housing Bill is one, but if there's anything else, maybe community wealth building.
I think probably the most important part, and what we hope the report also serves, is not just the evidence in relation to the rights of people in the Highlands and Islands. It's also, we've tried our best to make the international legal framework as accessible as possible. So when we talk about housing, for example, if you look at the conditions of adequacy, is a housing bill meeting all of those conditions of adequacy? So does it embed the right to legal security of tenure? Does it embed the need for services to be accessible, for housing to be habitable, for housing to be culturally adequate, which means access to green space, access to sports, cultural services, and so all of those elements, what in international law we call the normative content of the right, so the adequacy conditions, I would call on the Parliament, and we would call on the Parliament, as we have before, to scrutinise every piece of legislation in relation to those conditions of adequacy. So you could embed different pieces of legislation within that criteria. If we could ask those questions to ourselves, we would see, the level of impact, which the Human Rights Bill was supposed to be that catalyst. So, of course, the notion was a Human Rights Bill would have an impact in any other subsidiary legislation that would come through, but the Parliament could do that as of now with other pieces of legislation.
Okay. And is there anything specific that you have in mind, or we should just look at all of it coming? I mean, we've only got 13 more months or something.
Again, I suppose I would answer that with the same point about it being a way of working, and that we would expect and encourage the Scottish Parliament as the ultimate guarantor of human rights to ensure that all legislative proposals are secured in a human rights foundation and are about delivering those outcomes for all. And that means as well, of course, scrutinising the budget that we've just seen passed this week, and we've written. Our colleague Ali Hosey has had a series of blogs trying to remind the general public and elected members, of course, about the links between the allocation and spend of resource and the realisation not just of rights but of the outcomes set out in the National Performance Framework, and to see the relationship between public spending and resource allocation and outcomes, and to take a human rights lens to that. We've also seen the removal of some what could have been important legislation in terms of addressing some of the social care and healthcare issues, with the stay on the National Care Service Bill and the stay on the learning. The ELDAN bill. Across parliamentary scrutiny, the provision and security of legal aid is hugely important in securing access to justice. In September, the Commission produced a map of available advice services with human rights content. It's fairly sparse, as you would see. So again, in terms of the underpinning services that support individuals' access to justice are lacking. And in our own reports, and to merge both your questions, if I may, Ms Burgess, the traumatic effect of individuals as rights holders having to pit themselves against the complexities of Leviathan systems around care and social care were exposed in our deinstitutionalisation report, TikTok, looking at the right to independent living and the extent to which individual rights are not being met and individuals are being held in inappropriate care settings for extremely extended periods, decades. And the trauma to those individuals and their families is extensive. We've seen some recent announcements from the Scottish Government on fatal accident inquiries. Again, a hugely traumatic experience for families, and we certainly welcome the Scottish Government's intention to move. And so there is something that we would encourage Parliament to engage with and to ensure a human rights realisation in terms of any reform around fatal accident inquiry.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Convener.
That moves us nicely on to a question from Elena Whittam, who's joining us remotely. Elena.
Thanks, Convener, and apologies for the technical issues at the beginning of the meeting, which meant I missed the first few discussion points. I would like to explore a little bit further on the structural barriers to justice, and specifically how that actually relates to the quest for human rights budgeting. But if we can also think about it in terms of the mainstreaming of equalities and perhaps a gendered lens on it. So if we think about gender budgeting as well, I'm really aware of the issue of access to justice for those seeking remedy for domestic abuse, specifically in remote and Highland and Island areas. So I wonder if either Angela or Louise could comment on that, please.
Thank you very much, Ms Whittam. I could probably spend far too much time than we have on human rights budgeting and a gendered lens on budgeting, having formerly been the convener of the Scottish Government's Equality and Human Rights Budget Advisory Group, and where we have spent most of the devolution period trying to introduce a human rights lens with a gendered and wider equalities analysis to how resources are generated, allocated, spent and evaluated in Scotland. And I think the fact that we're still talking about pilots on gender budgeting some 20 years after the initial pilots is very dispiriting at best. And it's about a mindset, it's about a shift in ways of working, that human rights analysis and human rights impact assessment and taking a human rights-based approach should not be seen as additional or some kind of overlay to the business as usual of policy making, but have to be a way of doing that business, a way of thinking how rights are respected, protected and fulfilled in the way that resources are raised, allocated and spent. And that means ensuring that there is that, if we are to mainstream equality concerns within that, recognising the diversity and difference of experience and of realities for people. That would mean, as you have suggested, that ensuring that remedy to domestic abuse is effectively funded and resourced, and that again, I would express or disclose an interest there, having been a member of the Strategic Review of Funding for Violence Against Women and Girls, and a whole series of recommendations made in 2023, which I understand have not met with any kind of forceful implementation, which again is rather disappointing. So there's no lack of guidance, of tools, of drivers. The principal driver being the need to ensure that people are protected, their rights in all situations are protected, and that resources are allocated in such a way that those rights are fulfilled. But what we do need to see, I think, is more effective scrutiny and engagement, and that drive for action from Scottish Government.
If I may just come back very briefly on that. I mean, this is something I could speak about all day as well, from my background previously as a women's aid worker. But do we feel we're at the point where we do speak a lot about this, but the actual embedding a full equalities, mainstreaming of equalities, gendered look at the different policy decisions that we make, when we haven't quite realised that, and in the absence of a human rights bill, is that going to make that more tricky to achieve? Or do we feel that that's the panacea that will help us to get over that hurdle and actually implement these things on the ground?
I think it has to be both. I think a mainstreaming approach has been talked about for a very long time. The practice of mainstreaming is weak. The tools are not used well. In our own submission to the mainstreaming strategy consultation, we've highlighted again the use of tools such as human rights budgeting, but also the existence of the panel approach, the FAIR approach, which is an analytical process to work through the legality, the equality, the adequacy and participation of individuals, taking a human rights-based approach to policy making. So, as I've said, there's no shortage of tools and there's no shortage of warm words. But what we do need to see is that shift in policy making, and I think that needs to come across Cabinet and through and across the Scottish Parliament in the scrutiny by members of the Scottish Parliament. But in terms of government, it has to come across Cabinet and down through directorates, and for it to be a clear direction to policymakers at all levels that taking a human rights-based approach to policy making is not an add-on, it's not just for Christmas, it has to be the core way of doing business, and it may be a new business as usual, but it needs to be the core approach to policy making.
Thank you.
Just before we move on to the next question, policy making is obviously really important, and at the moment, do we get that thread running through all the policy areas to ensure that we do see human rights of those, particularly in remote and rural, being addressed? Specifically looking at national outcomes. When you look at the national outcomes, there's scant reference to rural areas. But you could say there's other areas of society which also don't merit a specific mention. But with the work that you've done, is it a glaring gap that remote and rural areas don't feature more in the work towards positive national outcomes?
I think the short answer to that is yes, and that's what our report really underlines. And again, the national outcomes and the national performance framework would be significantly enhanced if there were a human rights-based approach to how policies are formulated, resourced and implemented. There's a huge implementation gap, as we've just discussed with Ms Whittam. There's that gap between the rhetoric and the implementation. Some of that is about skills and capacity within public authorities, but some of it is about process. And some of it, I think, as this report shows, and Louise will have more to say on this in terms of rural and island assessment, is that people feel out of sight and out of mind. And that's what this report highlights, that people may live in remote areas, but their rights and access to justice should not be remote. But Louise has more to say.
Yes, for hours, which I won't. But I think there are two layers which are important, and I want to talk about impact assessment. From one side, we don't have impact assessment policies for remote and rural communities, so we do have them for island communities, but we do have remote and rural communities that feel that they are islands within the mainland and are cut off from the rest of the country at times, particularly this time of the year. And so that's a significant gap in terms of rural proofing a lot of the policy and legislation. And we can talk in detail about the lack of unflexible policy making or unlocalised policy making that has creates a significant barrier in the delivery of services. But the other side, which is also important, is to discuss some of the shortcomings of what we've seen with the island impact assessment. So from one side, the island impact assessment doesn't really take a human rights-based approach or considers the impacts of a policy or a legislation from a human rights perspective. The Island Act doesn't require that, and therefore, if we're talking about mainstreaming, mainstreaming has to have an impact, including on things such as an island impact assessment. But the other thing we've heard very loud and clear from both communities, but also within many of the Highlands and Islands, the Islands Council, is the fact that often island impact assessments are done without any consultation to the communities or even the council at times. So someone is developing an impact assessment from Edinburgh of what deems to be appropriate or not for an island community without actually engaging directly with the community. So no wonder there's a considerable shortcoming, or no wonder there is an impact assessment that says this will not have an impact, and it does. The other issue has been demands of retrospective impact assessments, which the legislation allows, and we see at times the government not wanting to do those retrospective impact assessments. So if we were to do a very thoroughly review of many pieces of legislation and policy across Scotland, we would probably change many of the ways of working, given that many policies and regulation are not really island-proof in the way that the Island Act would have expected.
We're certainly going to come back to that, and I hope I haven't stepped on any other members' footsteps feet doing that. But we're now going to move on to another question from Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning to you both. Interesting to hear what you've been saying so far. I'm interested in how the information was obtained in terms of methodology, because in our papers it says 146 individuals were interviewed across multiple locations, and I think there were about 20 locations across the Highlands and Islands, so that would average about 7.4 folks showing up at each session. But I know it was a mixed methodology because there was desktop and interviews and probably phone calls and stuff, so it would be interesting to hear about the participation, self-selecting, the people that would go to or self-select, that, you know, from MSPs and our caseworkers. People come to us when there's a problem. They don't come to us when everything's going okay. So I'm interested to hear about the methodology and about how we gather the information.
Sure. I'll let Louise speak to the detail, but to say, it was very much a mixed method, you know, with structured interviews and with open conversations, with the team being visible in locations and starting up, you know, informal conversations with people on their everyday experiences. But the structured methodology is set out in the report and is, as you suggest, the desk-based research, structured interviews, informal discussions, and then the sift across the MSP caseloads and complaints to the SPSO. But I'll let Louise speak to that while he's opening the page. Just to say as well, Louise has, and Ali Hosey and myself and other members of the Commission are background the area just now and have been meeting, Luis and Ali have been meeting with MPs, MSPs, council members, as well as some structured community empowerment events as well, which have had an attendance of somewhere between 15 and 20 people, I think. But Luis will be able to give us the detail.
So in Appendix 3, we explain in detail the methodology, and I should use this opportunity to say it is a methodology that has been really strongly commended by the UN and other international actors, because what we've done is to really try to change the way of working of a national human rights institution in a way that really enhances the views of people, which is often not necessarily the way that national human rights institutions gather information. That might be at times because there are significant data gaps. And so it's easy to say we're meeting our minimum core obligation because no one assesses or provides the sufficient data if that's the case. In terms of the process, so we did a desk-based research approach, and that looks at all the available information that exists and determined the significant gaps of areas that we just did not have sufficient information. We mapped out all the places we would want to be able to visit across the Highlands and Islands, and identified specific organisations, campaigners, defenders, teachers, crofters, advocates, nurses, advice givers are working with Citizens Advice Bureau, for example, to have semi-structured interviews, which are actually in the report itself, what the questions we asked. We don't actually usually ask people, can you tell us what your human rights issues are? We ask them specific questions, which include, can you tell me where you buy food? Is it costly? Can people buy it? How far is it? Is it always there? What happens when the ferry doesn't work? How many days are there no food here? How much does a house cost? What's the salary? Okay, and how many houses? Could you buy a house tomorrow? No. Where can you rent? And you see the questions we ask people. We often, anecdotally, I would say, most interviews starts with people saying, there's probably not much about human rights I can say. And 3 hours later, the interview ends. And so most interviews, there were around 130 interviews. Most interviews were individual. So, sorry, one-to-one, and in some occasions there were a couple of people in the room, and an average, an interview would take between an hour and a half or two, and often 3 hours. On top of that, there were the kind of informality of meetings, so we would usually speak to some people on the street. That's not the actual 146 people interviewed. Those would be part of the data that we would have on the street. That's then mapped out with interviewing many of the caseworkers of MSPs across the Highlands and Islands to determine what type of information they receive. That is then crossed with what information was received by the SPSO and what other data we had available to us from historically in the last 6 years. And we triangulate all of that. I should say one of the really important methods we use is that an issue was raised if at least in 3 different interviews the same issue was raised. And so if we couldn't verify, because only one individual said something, it might not have been showed in the report. There had to be at least 3 to 4 different instances in which independently an issue is raised and therefore then identified, evaluated and comes into the report.
And so I'm a member of the Health Committee as well, and we just did an inquiry into healthcare in remote and rural areas, and one of the big things that came out of that was just access to housing and recruitment and retention and things like that. And a lot of people were not very happy about the words remote and rural because it makes you as if you're other, somewhere over there, you're not part of it. We've even had proponents that want an agency be created to advocate for people in remote and rural areas, not just in terms of healthcare. And I know that the Scottish Government have created a National Centre for Remote and Rural Healthcare, or a Centre of Excellence as well, and that was launched in 2022. So I'd be interested to, were there discussions about, do people know that the Centre of Excellence for Remote and Rural Healthcare exists and that this has been created in order to support healthcare, for instance? And one of the things I also come across is that people don't really talk about the Scottish Graduate Entry to Medicine programme, which is specifically tailored to get rural GPs in the Highlands and in the southwest of Scotland. So I'd be interested to hear a bit of feedback about those kind of like healthcare aspects, about the people being interviewed. Were they aware of the Centre of Excellence in ScotGem, for instance?
So let me start by saying the issue on remote and rural, which I think can be contested at times, and we've said very strongly that remote and rural is a perspective, or remote is a perspective for many communities. Edinburgh and the government is the one that is remote. These communities have existed there for years, and as Angela very well has said, the fact that they are remote to Edinburgh or to the Central Belt doesn't mean that their rights should be removed in any way. However, I think it's important, because of some of the responses in relation to how, for example, rural housing is being built, that we do identify, or we use the category of remote and island, just to say that we have concerns, for example, that the government has responded to us in our report that 10,000 houses have been built in rural Scotland. Now, where are those houses being built? We visited many communities that there hasn't been social housing built since 1970s. So are those houses in rural Scotland outside of the Central Belt, in rural Scotland 20 minutes away from Inverness, or in some of the communities that are really having a significant issue in relation to depopulation? So that the usage of that term comes from accepting or trying to identify some of those barriers. In terms of knowledge, I think that's a really important point, which also relates to Mrs. Whittam's question in relation to barriers to access to justice. What we identified is there is a significant barrier is the lack of knowledge of people's rights. So not only the knowledge of the institutions that are there to promote or protect them, or knowledge about opportunities available, many of the questions, or many of the reasons why people say, I don't think I can speak much about human rights issues in my community, is because the lack of knowledge of thinking of housing or health or social care or food as a human right is not very well embedded. We ourselves in the Commission's work across the years, just 2 years ago, we published our second iteration of attitudes towards human rights in Scotland, and what we found is that in the Highlands and Islands, at least 30% of the population are disengaged with human rights, and that is often because of a lack of knowledge of what human rights actually means. Now, the proposals for a human rights bill from the National Task Force, which we were a key member of, included the need for a national campaign really to promote human rights across the country. And so what are the efforts to really explain to communities about what their rights are, what are the mechanisms that have been available? There are mechanisms available, most of them don't really know. And it is clear often one of the big things we would hear in many of the interviews was a thank you for just being there, because no one had necessarily visited them in a very long time. Not even a much of a desire of what the report would be, but just to make sure that we were there listening to them and promoting human rights. And that really gives you an idea of the sort of lack of knowledge, or how much many of the communities feel disengaged with national government or policy.
Okay, thanks.
Emma Roddick. Excuse me.
Convener, that was actually really helpful context on the methodology and the way to ask those questions that gets the evidence out of people. One thing I did want to raise was looking at the education section in particular, there aren't concerns, but I wondered if maybe there had been something missing there in the methodology, because I would have expected as a Highlands and Islands MSP that Gaelic would come into that, and access to culturally appropriate education in Gaelic medium.
I can say one of the interesting things when you publish a report like this is then after you publish, you get more and more and more information. So during the work we did, we had some concerns in relation to the Gaelic language, but not sufficient to kind of do the assessment. Another example was we didn't really hear much of concerns in relation to water and sanitation, with the exception of some public toilets, but not enough. And now we have actually a significant amount of data in relation to that, in which our assessment would have probably been different. It does give me the opportunity to say, if I may, that the Commission is committed to a cycle of monitoring. And so, as we've said, we will do the south of Scotland next in the next few months, but we will also re-evaluate the Highlands and Islands in 3 years' time. So there is opportunity to reassess some of the available evidence we had. Now, we wanted to very much embed what the rights holders would say, so it could depend on some of the challenges that were identified by specific communities or not. The other thing is we didn't engage necessarily with children and young people, given the mandate shared with the Children and Young Persons Commissioner for Scotland. And so our assessment is based very much on the views of different organisations and teachers, but not necessarily in relation to children, as you know, it would have duplicated the mandate of the Children's Commissioner.
Okay, that makes sense.
If I may, to just say as well, to read the section on education in conjunction with the section on rights to cultural identity, and to see the interplay there between where what we're seeing and what we've said in the report is the minimum core for education is being met, but that is that there is a right to education, for example, and that needs to be read with questions around has adequacy, has provision, etc. Have they rolled back in recent times? And then to look at cultural rights. And what we see is that there are concerns around the accessibility of the enjoyment of cultural rights, and so to read those in conjunction. That's not to say that Gaelic was specifically raised in the way that that triangulated way that Louise has talked about, but there is that read across between those interlinked rights.
I suppose, is there work going on around how those questions are formulated? Because I imagine it's very difficult to ask something that doesn't inevitably lead to the interviewer's expectations being brought out of the person. If you're asking about housing and cost of food, then people are going to talk about not having access to affordable food, but they might not mention Gaelic.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things, of course, is because this is a very different way of working, not only for us and not only in Scotland, but actually internationally, which is why we've been called many times now to explain our monitoring model to other NHRIs across the world and for the UN itself, is that we said that we were piloting a modality or approach. So we've only been a few weeks ago reflecting on what are the things we want to fine-tune and improve, and questions that we didn't pick up that we need to do, and what other evidence is coming. And so we would really welcome conversations with MSPs like yourselves as well, to say it would be great if you can include this or engage us in this process and so on, because we are trying to embed that in a kind of more permanent and sustainable way of working. But of course, there will be gaps that we identify that we now want to reflect and improve over time. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Tim Eagle.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you. It's been a really interesting discussion. I have to admit, I'm sitting here I've just been looking up your briefing papers on human rights budgeting to try and get it into my head. I might take you up on the offer to meet you separately to go through some of that, because I'm struggling a wee bit to understand how that, human rights comes into the context of the National Performance Framework and national outcomes, and then delivery, all within that context of the financial envelope we have. And hopefully one day I'll get my head around it. But my question is really around the Scottish Household Survey. So I think there was interestingly broadly a satisfaction across Scotland, whether that was rural or urban, in areas like schools and health. I think public transport, rural areas sort of suggested was worse. But I was just wondering, how in your research did you sort of factor in other surveys such as the Scottish Household Survey? And do you have any comments on sort of the comparison between your work and that?
So I think the biggest challenge we have with many of the data published nationally, including the Scottish Household Survey, is how much the numbers can hide away some of the issues. And we know that researchers, we know this, that quantified methods can hide away realities of smaller groups. So when you look at, for example, population of Inverness compared to the rest of the population of Highland, the satisfaction that you can say based on the population of Inverness will hide away a limited smaller group in Kinlochbervie. And so that is one of the biggest concerns. We use it as part of the contrasting element, but without actually looking at dividing that data in a way that really looks at sort of more remote communities. There is a significant gap. Just last week, I was discussing with some of the depopulation officers in Lochimver and in Ullapool, how if you look at depopulation across Highland, it doesn't look that bad, but if you look at significant pockets of Sutherland, it is dramatic. And so again, because of Inverness is growing, the population in the Highlands isn't necessarily a concern. If you look at Kinlochbervie or Lochimver or Ullapool or Tongue, then that concern varies. And so we were conscious of using that data to contrast what we were looking at, but we were also conscious of not overusing that data to then undermine what the testimonies directly of people in different communities were telling us.
It's a really interesting point, actually, isn't it? That actually we hide smaller groups because of a bigger subset. But I would have thought, I mean, I just have maybe made the wrong assumption that actually we would factor that into these things. But yeah, your evidence is that we're not. So yours actually allowed those smaller groups to have that voice, which otherwise they might not, where larger towns, and it might not even be Inverness, like areas like Elgin or Dingwall, for example, slightly larger populations, which are significantly bigger than West Coast villages of a handful of people. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely, if I may, about that granularity and about recognising that there is a difference between different populations, and that as we progress through this cycle of this project around Scotland, we will be able to then explore what differences exist, if any, but we know there will be differences. We've already highlighted the differences for Highlands and Islands, but what differences are there between different parts of Scotland? To what extent does remoteness play a part? Are the same issues relevant and live in people's everyday lives, experiences in different parts of Scotland, but are there different reasons why transport is different or access to housing is different? And we've seen, even in this report, we see that there are differences in, for example, availability of housing, but being able to access that housing, because while housing might be available, and this comes back to Ms Harper's point about the healthcare workforce and housing. If housing isn't available, then people can't take up jobs. If housing is available and there is a job, but there's no GP and no primary school, then that doesn't support a family. And so it's that interconnectedness that isn't immediately available from quantitative databases that needs that qualitative backup. And it's also very much part of our approach at the Scottish Human Rights Commission now, with our current strategic plan as approved by Parliament, which has a very strong participatory element. And if I can just cite you, one of the strongest quotes, I think, in our strategic plan is that any meaningful commitment to human rights must start from the ground up, with recognising the humanity of the people standing beside you. And so that immediately dispels the notion that human rights are somehow or other remote from our everyday, and that we must take that very experience-based approach, that reality-based approach to the realisation of rights.
Thank you.
Just on that, expectations or baseline and expectations is obviously going to be quite important, because the Scottish Household Survey showed levels of satisfaction, but was that in relation to what people thought, expectations were? So, I'll never forget a retired or a former chair of the Dumfries and Galloway Health Board saying that, well, people who live, and I'll not mention the community, live in a certain community, shouldn't expect that. And if they move to this area, they shouldn't expect to have a GP and they shouldn't expect to have a dentist. So some of these levels of satisfaction based on what people think they should expect to have. And therefore, where we see satisfaction for schools and satisfaction for transport, is that based on someone who lives in a small village going, well, you can't really expect the bus to come any more than once a day, and well, you can't really expect me to see a GP without having to travel 50 miles. So actually, if everybody was baselined and all had the same expectations, these levels of satisfaction would be significantly different.
I think that human rights are universal, and everybody should have access to the same adequacy, accessibility, quality of of service. Of service in order to realise their rights. But there's a quote in the report from a Community Development Trust representative who says, "We recognise the implications of living rurally. The community doesn't want all bells and whistles, but the bare minimum is currently not being met, and that's the issue." And I think, Convener, that answers that point about people aren't asking for any more than the bare minimum, because that bare minimum doesn't exist in all areas of their rights and in all areas of service delivery.
And if I can add, Convener, I think there's also a gap in relation to, as I mentioned before, the knowledge of what your rights are in relation to, for example, housing. So you might be satisfied within what you're being provided because you don't know actually that your right to housing should include a habitable, warm, accessible, culturally adequate, affordable, well-placed, well-serviced house. And therefore you accept that reality. But also what we nationally and different actors nationally have told rural communities over time of what they should expect, and therefore their expectations manage in that sense. And so historically then people have come to accept that that might be a reality. Now, we do hear as well over and over many communities saying, well, we do pay the same tax. We are taxed as everywhere else. We are council taxed the same. We don't get a discount because we don't have the services because we live rurally. So why are we not being provided with the same as others, particularly urban? And I think that is a question for national government to reflect on.
Thank you. Questions now from Rhoda Grant.
Can I just ask a supplementary on that last question? Because I don't think people expect accident and emergency around every corner, the services that are provided in urban areas. What they expect, I think, is services that fit the purpose of rural communities, and where we see services designed, I guess, with rural communities they work. And I don't know how we persuade decision makers to factor in the needs of rural communities. Emma talked about kind of the Remote Rural Institute. I don't think people are aware of it because they've seen nothing tangible come out of it. They've not seen service design fitting. And I don't know, have you any thoughts about how we push that forward and make sure that those people, that the policy makers are aware?
Touches on one of our recommendations, which is the lack of flexible and localised policy, but also creative policy making. There's a lot to learn from Nordic countries, for example, in relation to how remote communities and rural communities are provided with integrated care, different planning, consent permissions for housing, different healthcare provisions. And we don't seem to be learning from those models. We also have a lot of national policy that becomes really effectively an obstacle for the realisation of rights and the provision of services, where, just to say a few examples, where a planning consent only lasts 3 years, but on Shetland it might take 6, 7, 10 years to finish the social housing building because of the lack of sufficient staff to build the houses. And therefore a housing association have to re-evaluate every 3 years and re-ask for planning consent and change its budget and evaluate and change the housing project based on that and so on. We have limitations in relation to integrated social care with adult and young care, where it has worked in Nordic countries, it has worked in Alaska, but our legislation and our regulation in relation to the provision of care limits that, which makes that there is a, in my view at least, of what we found over and over and heard from a lot of communities, is that there is a historical resilience of many of our communities that is slowly being eroded and disappearing, because while they used to be able to do it for themselves because the government or the local authority wasn't able to be provided, now they are being told they cannot do it. And therefore they're not either getting the service or being allowed to provide for the services in their own terms. And I think that creates a significant obstacle in the delivery of many other services that can be available.
Okay, thanks. turning to the question I was wanting to ask, the report is saying that we need urgent action on homelessness, on hunger, on quality sexual and reproductive health services. Whose job is it to address that? Who should be doing it? And are you seeing any improvements, any action to kind of meet those urgent needs?
Thank you, Rhoda. And I think, again, I'd like to put on record our thanks to Rhoda Grant for pushing forward the members' debate. It was the first time that a report of the Scottish Human Rights Commission has been the focus of a debate in the full chamber. And so bringing that full parliamentary scrutiny to the report is very welcome. I think to link both your points there, while people might not expect an accident and emergency provision on every corner, the obligations are to provide adequate, accessible and appropriate care. And that links to your second question as to who is responsible. We have multiple delivery agencies with responsibility here. And I think what our report is underpinning is that there needs to be perhaps more improved dialogue and interconnected ways of working between service providers, thinking through with, we appreciate with limited resources, but how to allocate and design how to design services with limited resources in a way that meets, is flexible and responsive to the circumstances in which people live in the Highlands and Islands, and an acceptance that it is not, an acknowledgement that it is not acceptable to have to travel in very difficult circumstances for acute maternity and obstetric care. It's not acceptable that there is no forensic medical service in the Highlands and Islands to support victims of sexual assault. That's degrading and inhumane, and that needs to be the starting point, rather than, well, this is the envelope that we have and this is the way services are designed, therefore if people fall outside that, then well, we're very sorry, but we can't do much about that. The starting point needs to be, how do we ensure that everyone's rights are respected, protected and fulfilled? And that means taking a human rights-based approach so that sexual and reproductive mental health were all urgent areas of concern. And that, to pick up on a word Luis used there on resilience, the resilience of communities in accessing services and campaigning for local services and bringing their needs to the attention of local delivery partners have been, the resilience has been immense. And people are, coming back to Ms Burgess' point on trauma, people are exhausted, as you well know from your own caseloads, trying to bring forward these issues in a way that prompts a combined public service response to rooflessness, to homelessness, and addresses housing in a systemic way that, again, as Ms Harper touched on, that is linked to so many other aspects of everyday lives and to people's economic, social and cultural rights, and to see all of that as intertwined. And so that does require flexibility from public authorities. It requires improved joint working in a way that is perhaps, well, I don't want to really characterise the way that public services might work, but for there to be perhaps a more collective approach. And I know there are suggestions and there are some different ways of working in terms of unitary authorities or bringing together local authorities and healthcare. I mean, these are political questions that different parties have different views on, and different public authorities have different views on. But what we have tried to do in our recommendations is to set out not just what the legal obligations are, but what the ways of working need to be as well, which are to take into account and to engage with, in a meaningful, participatory way, local people and their needs, to listen to communities and to produce flexible and localised responses that take a human rights-based approach.
Okay. One of the things that I'm interested in is the right to food, and I'm looking at legislation to kind of enshrine the human right to food into Scots law. But are there other things, I mean, that we could be doing now to make sure that people have access to their right to food. It was one of the things that was in the report, and how should we go about it?
What we saw, and I think the levels of hunger are not as dramatic as they could be, is because of voluntary intervention. So it's because community groups, churches, food banks and others are able to provide the support that is needed. Now, this comes with very little government, local or national government action or support. So under a human rights term, it is the state's obligation, it is the national and the local government to respond, not for charities or volunteers or churches to actually provide people with the support of their right to food. We welcomed, when it came, the government's strategy and consultation in relation to ending the need for food banks and its cash-first approach. As of now, we haven't seen sufficient advancement in relation to that, and what type of measures are being reflected. There are models internationally where countries have adopted different type of food support through specific cards, for example, that can be used only to buy nutritionist food, and so it's not just, it's a cash-first approach, but it's not actually cash, it's a card that also addresses some of the concerns that some people have had in relation to how potential food vouchers are used. So there are creative solutions out there, and if we look internationally, the government could bring in specific measures. But as of last time when that policy was consulted, we haven't seen sufficient action or at least effective action in the last year or so.
You've mentioned a couple of times about international examples that maybe would be worth following. Is there any, you talked about Nordic countries, is Norway doing all this better than us, or is there another country that's doing this better than us? And I'm also kind of aware that Nordic countries kind of provide much better qualities of public services. You know, they pay higher taxes than us, but in return they have a much higher basic standard of living than we do. Is there any examples that we should be looking to follow, understanding that we maybe don't have all those tools at our disposal?
I think it depends on the right, it depends on the service, it depends on the policy, but there are a lot of examples, and often some of the examples are in developing countries. In relation to food support, for example, they're really good examples of the type of card measures that Colombia, Costa Rica, Peru, Venezuela have implemented. So we can look at our neighbours, but we can also look at abroad and further out of some of the measures that are possible to implement, including in countries with significant challenges economically, as you recognise, you know, the standard of living and the level of budget that maybe some Nordic countries can provide, but there are developing countries with significant less resources than we have that do provide better for their economic, social, cultural rights of their citizens, including for rural communities and indigenous peoples as well.
Wow, that's a bit of an eye-opener.
A quick follow-up on that. I mean, part of the obligations on state parties is to ensure the maximisation of available resources. And so that does take us into territory around fiscal policy and revenue raising and how public finance is generated, and to ensure that resources, you know, what can come into the pot is maximised through fiscal policy, through tax evasion, tax avoidance, as well as how resources are generated at the local and national level. And that's a requirement on states parties to ensure that they are taking all reasonable steps to maximise available resources to secure the progressive realisation of rights.
I hate having to do this, but just to let you be aware, we're past 3/4 through the session and we're not even halfway through the questions. So can I ask members, when it's time for their question, just to reflect on whether it's actually been answered, and in some cases that will be the case. I'm not going to ask for any supplementary at the moment, and if we've got time at the end, we'll bring people in. So I'm going to move straight to question 6 on the paper, and that's from Evelyn.
Thanks, Convener. I do think you've touched on quite a lot of the things that I'll ask about, but I'll ask if you want to say more. Obviously, the duty bearer's role is very important, which you highlighted at the beginning. Can you say any more about guidance that's available to help them do a good job and achieve good outcomes? And what's your role in this, and how do you support them to make sure that they meet their human rights?
There's lots more to say on that, Ms Tweed, thank you, but I'll try and keep it brief. The way we've structured this report and the whole approach to the whole methodology of this project, of this research, is to take the international standards, to take what the Committee on Economic and Social Cultural Rights has said over the years, and to put it into a framework, which is this red, amber, green framework that you see throughout the report, that says, these are the requirements, here are the gaps, so now you know where the gaps are. This gives you that prognostic. Having done the diagnosis, it then lets you prognosis, how you plot your way out of this. And this is designed in such a way as to be that guide for public authorities, for duty bearers, in addition to the plentiful guidance on human rights budgeting, as our colleague has said, on the Scottish Human Rights Commission website, along with a range of other supplementary tools on taking a human rights-based approach using the panel and FAIR principles. And what's our role in this? Well, our role is to exercise our mandate, limited as it is, which is to raise awareness of human rights and to promote human rights, and to try to and to educate on human rights. Our capacity, well, our legal powers are limited. We can't provide advice to individuals. And we can undertake, we have powers for investigation and inquiry, which are both quite expansive and quite constraining, because the scale of investigation and inquiry is not one that we can meet with our current resourcing levels or the interplay with our other powers. So we are quite limited. So doing what we're doing just now, which is bringing forward and improving the primary evidence base, bringing that to Parliament, supporting Parliament in its scrutiny, as well as engaging with rights holders and duty bearers in the way that we are, to build knowledge, to build capacity, to build that use of human rights frameworks into to make it a more usual, more everyday way of framing people's experience is the intention behind this report. Anything else?
Well, I would just highlight, as Angela has just said, we are revisiting the communities just now. We have been providing support and empowering human rights defenders, community workers, charities to use the findings and the framework of the report. We have been meeting local authorities and NHS boards and some housing associations as well. So we've just been to Shetland, to Orkney, and we've gone through Caithness and Sutherland, and I've just flown from Stornoway. And so we've been having those meetings. Now, we are also getting a lot of requests to help councils, for example, in their capacity building, their knowledge, their skill set, their policy. And the reality is, as in our current staffing and resource level, it would be quite impossible for the Commission to do that in the way that we're being asked. So it's a lot also a reflect of the role of us as a national human rights institution and our capacity to meet some of the demands.
Thank you, Convener. The SHRC obviously puts a lot of importance on speaking to lived experience, and that duty bearers must do that to be successful. Could you say a bit more about why that's important?
I think it's foundational to our approach. As I've said, it's one of the cornerstones of our strategic plan. We also, as a Commission, have just approved our participation strategy, which will be published next month. And that's about ensuring that participation is a way of working for the Commission, which is working alongside with and through a range of stakeholders. So amplifying the voices of rights holders, improving their knowledge and understanding of their rights, which again is consistent with our mandate to educate around human rights and to promote awareness of human rights. Part of our participation strategy will also include what we hope is moving towards best practice, certainly good practice, which is to include participation payments, recognising that much of the consultation, many of the consultation methods used in policy making rely on the goodwill and personal contributions of time and travel, etc., for people to participate in consultation. I mentioned our TikTok report on deinstitutionalisation. That absolutely puts into plain view our way of working alongside people who have experience of care settings, their families, other condition or specific or advocacy organisations and other research organisations and duty bearers in a project group, and then working with human rights defenders, so people with care experience and their families seeking to secure their rights, producing a video and a toolkit that others can then use to help navigate the system. So that's very much becoming the character or hallmark of the way of working of the SHRC.
Thank you for that. It did stand out to me in a couple of places in the report that the information seems to be coming from professionals and those offering support. And this maybe goes back to methodology a little bit, but certainly, particularly the addictions section, there's some really interesting evidence there around the impact of services not being there or loss of services. But there doesn't seem to be much coming from people living with addictions. And I wondered at that point, when you realise there's an issue here that we need to include in the report that's come from professionals, was that an opportunity to then seek out lived experience and make sure that those voices were included?
I would say one of the things we were concerned in our sort of ethical research framework was ensuring that we were ready to be able to support people in particularly situations of vulnerability, if that came to be. And our limited mandate and powers did restrict us in a way. We were quite concerned if someone came with a very serious concern. Our response at this stage, because we are prohibited in our legislation to give any advice or support to an individual, would be thank you very much, good luck. Which would be quite responsible for a national human rights institution to do. So we needed to make sure that we were ethically doing it in the right way by using those who speak directly on a day-to-day basis to enhance those voices. And at times we did use some of the conversations by, for example, in some drug recovery hubs, where someone would bring a couple of people in with them to use those, to have that. So I think it was just that framework. It is something we are reflecting now of how we could bring more people into the room and have those conversations, and if we have a sufficiently trauma-informed mechanisms of interview, and we've been doing training and support in relation to that. But at that time we started this pilot type of work, we didn't feel it would be sufficiently responsible to do it in that way.
Thanks.
Beatrice Wishart.
Convener, and good morning. And I'm interested in what we've been discussing about what we can learn from Nordic countries. I mean, in Shetland, I think we often look across with considerable envy at how things seem to work in the Nordic countries. But looking at national infrastructure, for example, transport infrastructure, and how that impacts on the delivery of services, health, housing, education, is there anything you can say about the importance of national infrastructure when you look at, for example, Faro with their connections with tunnels and the ease with which that means that services can be delivered, taking them away from the centre and delivering them to people in more rural areas?
I was just quite quickly just going to agree with you on the central importance of integrated transport, and that so much else flows from, sorry, that wasn't meant to be a pun, so much stems from integrated transport in terms of the right to access to food, access to clothing, access to education, cultural identity, access to healthcare, etc. It's absolutely integral, it's pivotal to the fulfilment of rights and to that full realisation of rights. And if that is a mindset that comes into thinking about infrastructure, it's about how to deliver, how to ensure that people not only have the right but can exercise those rights. It's that shift in mindset rather than starting with, well, this is a very big project that's going to cost a lot of money and can we really do it? Well, what is the purpose of this project and what are we seeking to achieve? Well, what we're seeking to achieve is the realisation of people's rights and securing their well-being and the sustainability of individuals and communities.
And if I can add on the issue as well as long-term solutions as well, and ensuring the accessibility of service is not thinking just in the immediate response, what could we do now, but what can we do in a long term? And again, and the needs localise. For Shetland, it might be that the Faroe approach is the best by building tunnels into islands. I just had a discussion with the council in Highland Air in Stornoway on Monday, where their demand is actually we don't need a big ferry, we need two medium-sized ferries to actually ensure what our connectivity is. So it's not a national response to ensure transportation, is what works at a small local level. In relation to a really well-commended policy in relation to free travel for young people, frustration of many people we spoke to is, well, there is no transport to use for free for young. So what is the support being provided for the young people in Highlands and Islands because there's no free transport? Is there another alternative? Is there a localised mechanism that isn't provided? We don't really see that, and that's really fundamental.
Another barrier is, of course, the cost of travel. And for those who want to get out the islands and onto the mainland, that's more of an observation than a question. If I could move on, we've also touched on island impact assessments, and I think there's a feeling, certainly in my constituency, that they're a bit toothless. They don't really mean much. And just how could those be improved? I understand the call for making them, for expanding them to the Highland areas, for example, other rural areas. So how can that be improved, that process, to make them less toothless?
Well, I'll start, and if I may, and let Louis come into the specifics on the island and the rural. We have a human rights impact assessment, equality impact assessment, islands impact assessment, and my experience of many years of working across, working with trying to embed those processes and support government and support duty bearers to implement those policies, those tools, is that they are seen as additional rather than as enabling, rather than ways of doing things that are all pointing in the same direction, which is ultimately about the quality of people's lives and securing their rights, rather than I'm trying to think of a polite word, that an additional layer of bureaucracy that is additional, that overlays the business as usual. They should be business as usual because they're about asking a whole range of questions in order to ensure that the policy and the resources aligned to it are going to have the outcomes that people need and that the policy is intended to have. So it's about, again, shifting that mindset to making these ways of working integral. There's talk of mainstreaming strategies. We've been talking about mainstreaming for 20 years plus. These are tools that help that mainstreaming, that activate that mainstreaming, and that when we start to talk about policy and resourcing, that's where mainstreaming is activated. It becomes a full circle because we talk about policy and resource in the same, in the round. But I'll let Louis talk about the specifics on islands.
I think there's a couple of things we can briefly suggest. One, of course, is that it should take a human rights-based approach. At the bare minimum, it should actually consult people in the community before it makes an assessment, which we don't see. At times, even the councils are not even consulted. That would be even less of a bare minimum. But people in island communities should be consulted before a policy is assessed to determine if it works or not. I think for us, there's questions about the works of how a national government operate. We can ask ourselves a question: shouldn't the island team of the Scottish Government be based on an island? Shouldn't there be a hub of the Scottish Government in some of the island communities to operate? I am sure, having done this work and led this work myself, that an official actually living in a community would themselves directly see an assessment quite differently because of their own experience, which we don't see actually happening. So participation is very key, but I would also commend for this committee to play a role in the type of rural assessment or island assessment that I can do. That is either by taking the time to scrutinise some of the policy, some of the legislation going through Parliament. Should there be a session per legislation to give reassurances that it has been island-proof, that it has been scrutinised well? You might not have the sufficient time to do that very thoroughly with every piece of legislation, but a session pair legislation might be something welcome to take evidence on some of the lack of retrospective island impact assessment that is happening. There could be models of actually creating a specific working group to really reflect on what are the wider national policy that isn't working, and it might require the necessary modification. So I think there are various mechanisms available for the Parliament to reflect.
Thank you.
Thank you. Emma Roddick.
Thank you, Convener. I wondered what evidence there is that duty bearers are creating those target objectives that could progressively improve human rights, and what's your feeling of how much resource and finance is being put into this?
I think the way, I suppose, to answer the question is that the evidence in this report suggests that these are not the usual ways of working, if that's not too subtle. But because I think what we've heard very clearly that islands impact assessments, where they're conducted and how they're conducted, are not working. We've heard from some local authorities that they suggest their approach is we don't use the phrase human rights, but we do take a human rights-based approach. Well, we would need to see evidence of human rights impact assessments being used and being informed by a range of data in a way that I'm not sure. But our report wasn't focusing on those practices within duty bearers. That may well form part of future research and explorations, but it wasn't the focus. Those processes themselves weren't the focus of our report, which took a bigger focus on the extent to which local people were involved and participated in decision making.
If I can add, we recognise various different significant strategies of the Scottish Government that do constitute targeted and concrete steps for the progressive realisation. Now, some of them are recent, so it's difficult to make an assessment if they have been effective, if they have been expeditious. Some of them are very welcomed, but they've taken a significant long time to develop. So you might have a housing crisis for a very long time, and it is only now that we see a strategy. At times, what we are concerned is some of the strategies might not necessarily take a human rights angle or an approach. So they are welcome, but there are questions about, are they really framed within what is demanded from a human rights perspective? And are they a strategy or are they targets? And it does bring questions of, is it clear what the concrete target steps? Is it clear the level of financing and budget placed to achieve these steps? Is it clear the accountability if these targets are not met? So we do see a lot of strategies and not necessarily targets. I'll leave it there.
And what do you think the biggest problems are then with when there are targets that exist? Are they not written far enough in advance? Are they, the first things to go when there's challenges that come up?
I would say, using again one of our recommendations of listening to communities, we do see an awful lot of decisions made being consulted, and the frustration of many communities is that these are tokenistic exercises of consultation. That a human rights-based approach would do it the other way around. It will start by consulting the community. What are the issues? What are the needs? What are the potential solutions? How do you see what works for you and what could be different? Then for government or local authorities to step out, go back, reflect, envision options, and then return to say, these are our options. Let's have a consultation. What would you like us to do? What we see is a decision has been done by an authority, often without any involvement of people. That decision wants to be carried through, and then a consultation is done in which many communities feel they are forced to say yes. And yes, but, or, well, you don't disagree, okay, fine. And so just in the last few weeks, a significant frustration of some of some of the decisions being made and some of the consultations, for example, in relation to the tourism levy and the impact for some communities saying, the impact is not on our accommodation. We are small bed and breakfast. We are being forced to agree. Our issue is in relation to camper vans and the impact for our roads. And so, again, that seems to have been a consultation, that a decision has been done, consulted, not let's consult people in Highlands and Islands, see what their real challenges is, and developed a consultation and a policy on what their needs are actually based.
Just very quickly, I can see the convener is very keen to move on. But in taking a human rights-based approach, it's about what targets, how are they formulated, what are the indicators, and what we would advocate and what we would advise is that, and what's required within the human rights standards is that indicators are framed around structure, process and outcome. And to take an approach that has those indicators, that then has those very clear measurable elements of, is the structure appropriate? Does it involve people adequately and appropriately and accessibly? What's the process? Is it accessible? Is it understandable? Is it clear? Does it integrate human rights analysis through policy making and resource allocation? And then what are the outcomes? Are the outcomes what we said we wanted with the targets, or are we, and if not, why not? And then we can work back through process and structure to see if they're in the right place or not, and that's what's having an effect on the outcomes. So there's a clear pathway in the international human rights standards.
Thank you. I think that last statement, the questions you raised there, it should be by default in every single questionnaire we have when we have government ministers in front of us. So that's very helpful. I'm going to move on now to Elena Whittam.
Thanks, Convener, and I'll be very brief with this because we've already touched on human rights budgeting, but I'm just wondering whether the Commission think that there is enough resourcing out there that's actually going to allow for effective human rights budgeting to be done. And I'm specifically thinking about resourcing round about local authorities, but also the way that they resource some of our other multiple delivery agencies that they directly resource as well. So how do we make sure that we can actually achieve that human rights budgeting within resource allocations?
Human rights budgeting is a way of working through resource allocation, well, resource raising, allocation and spend. It's not about, I mean, we can all challenge the size of the pie, but it's a process, it's an approach to ensuring that how decisions are made, how policies are formulated, take a human rights-based approach. As I said earlier on, there's the obligation to ensure the maximisation of available resources, and so that is about thinking about, is the pie big enough, how to expand available resources, and are decisions being made around how public resources are being raised, consistent with that obligation and consistent with a human rights-based approach to ensure that rights are protected, respected and fulfilled.
Okay, so that actually really illustrates very well, I think, the issue that I've come across over many years. When we talk about the size of the pie itself, we forget about how that pie is divvied up and how organisations are actually responsible for divvying up that pie in a way that reflects the needs of the people that they're seeking to serve. So I think it's very helpful that we've got that on record within the committee this morning. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Anne Burgess.
This has been a really brilliant conversation this morning, and I wish we had a few more hours to go into some of the detail that started to kind of raise up in my mind. But the intention now is to share the findings across the Highlands and Islands and enable local communities to use the report to defend, and a word that I heard you use, access their rights. And I'd be interested to understand how you plan to use the report to help enable communities to do that, defend their rights, access their rights.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, I mean, we're Louise in the thick of this at the moment, working through the report with communities across Highlands and Islands. We'll take the lessons learned from our methodology, from our questions, from the feedback from human rights defenders and duty bearers in the Highlands and Islands to inform when we move into the south of Scotland later this spring, and then move around Scotland with this approach over the next few years, so that at the end of the strategic plan period, we have this overview of Scotland. We can look at any differences that are emerging as well as the common themes, and have a very clear understanding as well by that point of the extent to which We are building knowledge and use of a rights framework by duty bearers and by rights holders, but Louise can comment on the specifics of how we're structuring the community empowerment events.
Yes, so we are travelling to everywhere we were before. We want to make sure we're not extractive, but we are also empowering people to use the findings of the report. And we are very much in the middle of that. And I'll be tomorrow in Benbecula and Friday in Barra. And so we're really wanting to make sure that the communities and anyone interested, but particularly those who can be advocates of change, can use the framing of the report. Part of that does feel like teaching, I confess. So it has been really, with the report open and saying, what does progressive realisation mean? What does minimum core mean? How to ask the correct questions. You have a right to an accessible, affordable, adaptable health service, of a good quality service. Make sure that these are the questions that are being framed. Make sure you contact your MSPs with this type of information. Report back to us to make sure we can raise this issue. So we're making sure that we serve, as the National Human Rights Institution is supposed to be, that bridge. And so that's a significant part of our work, and while we reflect what we can do in the sort of medium to long term as well. The other side, of course, is we very much welcome this conversation, and we would encourage you to also take evidence and scrutinise a government in relation to their response. As so far, we have a limited response on the government reflecting on the findings of the report and taking consideration of available options, but that is really very much everything we've heard from government so far. So it is possible for this committee, and we encourage you to take further evidence on that, while we continue to try to influence government and local authorities of what could come next. But I don't know if Angela wants to. Yeah?
Can I just come on? You said it feels a lot like teaching. You're having to explain a lot to people. Are human rights embedded in our curriculum at school, so that we've got younger people who are growing up knowing what they are?
Yes, I mean, but again, to perhaps to varying degrees, but certainly, you know, the national, insofar as I'm aware, and from my experience as a parent, and being extremely pleased when my then primary school age child came home brandishing her declaration of human rights information, and thinking, my goodness, how times have changed. But I do think that is variable, and I also think it's part of our human rights aren't embedded in our national discourse, in our everyday conversation. And I think not only is that our mandate to promote awareness, to raise awareness of human rights, to promote human rights and to engage in education around human rights, but it's a collective responsibility to talk about human rights in the everyday. You know, they're not remote or exotic. They are about our everyday, and about how we live our everyday lives and what expectations we have for the people we serve to have for their everyday lives.
Thank you.
That gives me a great end to congratulate a primary school in my region, Garliston Primary School, under the stewardship of Caroline Howitts, and the teacher there have recently won an award, if you like, for the work they've done in human rights. But it's something that I see regularly, that the primary schools are doing that sort of work, which is absolutely fundamental to ensuring people recognise what they should and should expect as they go through life. So great to have the opportunity to say that. Tim Eagle.
Well, I think actually my question's just been answered, but it's maybe worth, I was going to ask what the response was you'd had from the Scottish Government, and then sort of what your big summary is, you know, what's your big message to us? But I think actually you've just said that actually not just the Scottish Government, but each of us as MSPs have a responsibility in representing our constituents to be pushing and questioning and constantly asking that. So, I mean, unless there's anything else you want to add, I think you sort of summarised it then.
That's fine.
Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. Just a quick question. Professor O'Hagan, you said you're coming to the south of Scotland. How will you let people know that you're coming to the south so that they can engage with the next part of your engagement?
We'll be using a whole range of things, but again, I'll let Louis speak to the specifics, but we'll be using all sorts of forms of social media. We'll be working through MSPs, so we'll be in touch with MSPs and your offices. We'll be in touch with local authorities, with integrated joint boards, with community health partnerships, etc., as well as the voluntary sector interface and a whole lot of other organisations that you would expect us to be to boost that word of mouth, as well as what we'll be doing through a whole range of communications channels. Is there anything I've missed there, Lewis?
I mean, I think that covers it. I would say the only big learning for us has been working a lot with local media, small local media, which we've never had the capacity to do. So actually creating those relationships and working directly with small local media has been really significant. So we want to replicate that for the south of Scotland as well.
Okay, thanks.
Emma Roddick.
Convener, just quickly, we talk a lot about intersecting inequalities when it comes to equalities and human rights budgeting, but that tends to focus on the protected characteristics in the Equality Act. From the work that you've done here, does there need to be more consideration of how inequalities relating to rurality and island living can also accumulate on top of other inequalities?
Thank you. I think that question is consistent with what we've been saying about how the different tools are used, and that they're not standalone. And you know, the equality characteristics as protected in the Equality Act, for which we are not the regulator, but nonetheless should obtain absolutely in public authority decision-making under the Public Sector Equality Duty. The Public Sector Equality Duty doesn't and shouldn't sit as a separate activity. You know, compliance with the Public Sector Equality Duty shouldn't be separate from effective islands analysis, because what applies in PSED applies in island and rural communities. And so it's about getting that practice within public authorities better. That really needs significant improvement.
Thanks.
And very briefly, Ariane, if your question and response are likely to be succinct, I'll bring you in.
Thanks, Convener. I really appreciate that. Something that strikes me, we talked earlier about there's the individual situation, but the need to change systemically. And something that's come up for me is in this conversation is around governance, around situations where people are not in the boardrooms, so we're talking about engagement and consultation, but I wonder if we also need to be looking at structures of governance where we actually put the people in the room. And I would say that the community planning partnerships are an attempt in that direction that works to some degree in some places and others not. I just wonder what your thoughts are around that kind of structural change.
I think, again, taking a human rights-based approach, using the panel principles, using the fair analysis process does bring people into, and then, as I said a moment ago, in terms of structure, process and outcome. So open up structures, bring people in, have a clear intention for that, and ensure that it is well supported and not, Louise used the word extractive a moment ago, and that there is a clear purpose and that is sustained, and that people feel that they are being heard and that their contribution is valuable.
Okay. Thanks.
And very lastly, and it should have been a supplementary, Emma Harper's, with the work you do in the south of Scotland, is there any lessons that you've learnt, whether you work in the Highlands and Islands, that you might have a slightly different approach to the south of Scotland? Now, we know that we don't have the island community in the south of Scotland, but very much similar challenges. Will you have a slightly different approach to address some of the findings from the Highlands and Islands surveys?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are different logistical challenges between the distinct regions. We've been going through a process of lessons learned around our methodology and around our questions. Some of the secondary data will also shape some of the focus of inquiry. But again, Louise, do you get anything specific?
Trying to be brief because, again, I could speak about an hour on methodology, which I don't think anyone wants to, but There's a few practical things we want to do different. One of them addresses one of the questions from Mrs. Roderick. For example, we are evaluating on continuing to having the individualised semi-structured interview, but having at least a town hall meeting per area per week. So bringing a variety of voices into the room, and that could be a few dozens or more. And so using that as a further evidence gathering, but also the opportunity for us to explain about human rights and look further. So we are looking as well as where to sit the boundary. The Highlands and Islands region worked quite neatly within council areas. The south of Scotland works less, and so we might tweak around what south of Scotland might mean to make sure that we are consistently looking at both the council area and the regional area. So it might be that it broadens a wee bit more into, for example, West Scotland to make sure that it just includes part of the council area in that sense. So that's part of what might look a bit different. And there will be added questions into the framework that we're looking at to get more evidence based on the learning we had.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Yanis and Professor O'Hagan. Your contribution today has been fascinating and hugely welcome, and I'm sure whilst we might not get back to the report itself, what we've heard today will certainly inform our questions and our scrutiny of our legislation we go forward through this session. So thank you very much for your time. I suspend this meeting for 10 minutes.